Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Hey listeners, it's Lindsay Smith Rogers. Today, severe weather forecasting. Hurricane specialist and storm surge expert Michael Lowry talks with me about the recent flash flood tragedy in Texas, how far hurricane and severe weather forecasting has come in the last 10 to 15 years, and how changes in funding and data availability may leave forecasters flying blind. Let's listen. Michael Lowry, thank you so much for joining us on Public Health on Call. Tell us a little bit about your work.
Yeah, I have a different background. I'm a meteorologist by education, so I have a bachelor's and master's degree in meteorology with a focus on tropical meteorology. But I've kind of worn three hats in my career. I've been a researcher and scientist and forecaster, including time at the National Hurricane Center. I have been an emergency manager, both at the state level for the state of Florida in the very busy 2004-2005 hurricane seasons. And then I was a program manager heading up the planning group at FEMA that oversees all of the disaster plans that are written, not just for hurricanes, but hurricanes is kind of the bread and butter of FEMA. And then time as a broadcaster, I was a hurricane expert and specialist for the Weather Channel on air. And then now I'm down here in South Florida in Miami, where I'm their hurricane specialist and storm surge expert. I've done a lot of work in storm surge research and modeling. I've built many of the models that the National Hurricane Center uses to forecast storm surge. And when I was down there, I was leading the team that developed all of these new products and watches and warnings that were introduced specific for storm surge. That's the deadly coastal part of a hurricane that's pushed ashore by the strong winds of a storm. And previously, in the last 10 years, we didn't have a dedicated storm surge watch and warning like we would for hurricane winds or for flooding, rainfall flooding, but we have that now.
And why do you have that now?
Well, we realize that storm surge is a very important thing. I mean, it carries with it the biggest potential for large loss of life. One of the big issues with storm surge is that it's not simply associated with where the hurricane comes ashore. Deadly storm surge can extend hundreds of miles away from a hurricane. So there were instances where we had a hurricane that would hit and the deadly storm surge was outside of the hurricane warning. And we want to make sure that we're getting the warnings to people that may fall out of the wind warning that, hey, there's a chance of potentially life-threatening water impacts.
And when you say storm surge, I assume that you're not just talking about oceans. You might also be talking about smaller bodies of water too. Is that correct?
You can be. Yeah. I mean, for hurricanes, it's primarily the sea. It's salt water, but there are big freshwater bodies of water. There's Lake Okeechobee down here in Florida that can have very damaging and destructive and life-threatening storm surge. We've seen it in past hurricanes. The 1928 Lake Okeechobee hurricane is the example that really comes to mind, but that's still a problem and a concern today. And then, of course, the Great Lakes region has storm surges associated with the sort of big winter storms that come through.
Everybody's still processing the tragedy that occurred in Texas, and you have written about this, and we will link to that in the show notes. People want to know why this happened. There are questions about whether there were ample warnings. Can you walk us through what you know?
That's a natural human response when there's a big disaster and a lot of people die. I mean, it's absolutely horrible what we've seen in Texas, and the efforts there that are still ongoing. In terms of the warnings, that's the first place you look. I said, well, did we see this coming? Did we have enough warning to the people who are in harm's way? This was a flash flood event, which are very localized, small-scale events, very difficult to forecast days in advance like you would a hurricane. That you could see a hurricane come in. Typically, you have plenty of time to prepare. You can get people evacuated. These flash flood events, you might see a general setup that could promote flash flooding, but you don't know the specifics. You don't know how much water you're going to get. And when the water falls, there's the complex terrain that play into it. So actually modeling these things is incredibly difficult and computationally expensive. The computer power it takes to model this stuff is, we're just getting to the point now we can actually model some of this inundation potential in real time. But the Weather Service, they did as well as you could reasonably expect for this type of scenario. The very fact that they had brought in staffing the evening beforehand to make sure that they were more than doubling the forecasters that they would have had on the desk that night just tells you that they knew there was the potential for some big time weather event that might happen. The watches went up, the flood watches went up 12 hours in advance saying, hey, the ingredients are there. We don't know precisely where it's going to be, but these areas were under a flood watch well in advance of the worst flooding. And then the flood warnings started going about 3 hours in advance of the actual flooding. And those warnings included a considerable tag that would have set off the WIA alerts. So everybody that was able to receive a cell phone emergency alert would have gotten it at 1 a.m. The worst of the flooding hit somewhere in the 4 to 5 a.m. local time. And then those flood warnings were gradually ramped up where they eventually issued a flash flood emergency. So what was it? I mean, I think it's going to take a little bit of time to unravel, but I mean, one of the most obvious things for me is that this happened in the dark of night. It's the very worst time to have catastrophic flash flood like this. When the rivers rise, it comes in quickly and there's not a whole lot you can do. It was a holiday weekend, so you had campers that were parked right along the Guadalupe River. I just think a combination of those things, and I'm sure there were other factors involved. Some of these areas were a little bit more rural. Did people have their phones with them? The question of when you get an alert, we've all gotten the alerts, the Amber alerts we get on our phone, and you immediately, how do I silence this thing? So I'm hopeful in like any disaster that we can learn from this and we can make it better and we prevent these tragic losses of life.
I want to differentiate. You can help us differentiate here the difference between a watch and a warning.
Yeah, the difference in a watch and a warning is just the timeline. A warning just means there is an imminent threat, life-threatening threat from some sort of weather. A watch means that we're keeping an eye out. The ingredients are there, if you will, but we don't quite have the direct threat.
Right. So in the event of a warning, the imminent threat is here. What is the course of action that people should be taking? I think about particularly a flash flood. Where do you go? What do you do? What is the way to keep yourself safe?
Yeah, I mean, that's the big overarching question. Flash flooding has always been one of the more difficult things that we can take action for. I mean, there are things that you can do. The first thing you do is get to high ground as quickly as you can. That's what you can do if the flash flood is happening. Whenever there's a potential strong wind threat and you have a lower interior room and a basement, the guidance is to get down and stay in those areas. Even if you're not under an imminent threat, if it's in the overnight hours when you may be sleeping, it's a good idea to make sure that you're protecting yourself in advance. The other thing, too, is just make sure that you have a way to receive the alerts and make sure it's either through your phone. We still recommend NOAA weather radios to people. It's really your best line of getting those warnings.
This is happening when I think a lot of people are hearing about changes taking effect with NOAA involving information that's used in hurricane forecasting and some of these warning systems that are going out. Put all of this in the context of these changes that are occurring.
The worry that we have in this instance, I know a lot of people are looking to use this as an example as to what went wrong with the forecast, but actually it's an example of what went right with the forecast. They did what they should have done. They brought people in advance to make sure the office was staffed. They used the flood guidance tools that are available to them to give us the best forecast they were able to give. The reason they were able to take on additional staff in those offices was because the forecast was that good. So the worry is these cuts that are being proposed to NOAA, which is the parent agency of the National Weather Service. These are very significant cuts that the administration is proposing, and the cuts would eliminate many of these tools that forecasters lean on to make their forecasts. There are flash flood guidance tools, for example, that are available. The closure of these labs, there are dozens of NOAA laboratories around, and then cooperative institutes that are affiliated with the universities around the country. With the proposal that NOAA has put out for their 2026 budget, it would close all of these labs. And so then the forecasters don't have the guidance that they would need to know that there is a significant flood threat for a certain area, or to know that there's an imminent threat for life-threatening flooding. I can assure you that the forecasters that night in the Texas offices that were part of this event were looking at those guidance products that are available from those laboratories. So there's a very much a concern about what happens beyond 2026 if these cuts go through.
And you've been doing this work for a long time. You mentioned that you've been on the ground, for like 20 some odd years looking at these things. How have things changed over time? Maybe floods happening in places where you didn't expect it, or people aren't used to dealing with it, or not used to paying attention to warnings, and now we're potentially not going to have as much information.
A good example that I use in the hurricane world is rapid intensification. For many years in the early and mid 2000s, there were a lot of storms that struck the coastline and would weaken upon landfall. It's the opposite now. The research is showing us that the storms are strengthening more quickly. They're doing it closer to land, and it's a direct tie into climate change. And particularly the warming of the waters near the coast and in the Gulf that surround the Gulf Coast, those are warming at a very, very fast clip. And that's where we're seeing these higher end hurricanes really taking off like a top when they come in. We've had so many instances of these storms that go from a tropical storm to Category 5 in 24 hours. And that for a hurricane forecaster, that's pretty much a nightmare scenario. We've been lucky that we haven't had one that wasn't seen on the U.S. coastline in recent years, but we have seen it elsewhere. I mean, we saw Otis in Acapulco in 2023 that did just that. It went from a tropical storm and Category 5 hurricane, and the models didn't see it. The models didn't detect it. The great thing is that we have come a long ways in forecasting intensity of hurricanes. That was a part of the science that we had made very little, if any, progress on for decades. In the last 10 years, we have seen really great strides there, and it gives us a lot of confidence now when we put out these forecasts. And you've seen that big hurricanes have hit our coastline, and we have had some pretty serious loss of life. But in other instances, it probably would have been a lot worse 10 or 20 years ago.
And so the changes that may take place, is this going to, make it harder?
Yes, absolutely. This is a concern for all of us in the field. There was a press conference that was held just the other day with hurricane experts, scientists that have been in this field for 45, 50 years to stress how significant and severe the cuts that are being proposed would be to hurricane forecasting. Again, going back to that analogy of the tools and that we use, you're cutting these major laboratories. There's a large hurricane research laboratory here in Miami that gives us all of the stuff that we need to accurately predict these really destructive hurricanes, and they're talking about shutting that down. Our only skillful models that we have to forecast the intensity of hurricanes come from these laboratories and these institutes. So I don't know what you do. If you don't have this, I don't know how I can do my job. It's going to set us back decades. It's not an exaggeration. There is nobody in this field that is not worried about the future right now.
What's the timeline for these changes potentially taking place?
The proposal is going through the appropriations process right now, so Congress has to approve the proposal. If it were enacted, you're talking about for the fiscal year 2026, which would start in October. So this would be very soon if it were implemented, certainly into next hurricane season. We've already seen issues, though, with the staffing reductions at NOAA for this hurricane season. We only have about half of the staff that are needed to fly the Hurricane Hunter airplanes that are a very significant part of our observation system, our monitoring network. So we're looking at a greatly reduced number of hurricane flights this year. And that's, again, another worrisome thing because there's no easy way to see the structure of hurricanes without either putting a hurricane airplane into the hurricane or having very specific satellites that can peer down through the clouds. We don't have a lot of those satellites. And the 6 or 7 that we have, half of those are going to be cut off at the end of July. So we're already seeing a degraded monitoring network that we would typically lean on all hurricane season. So I hope this season is quiet for a whole host of reasons. I never want to see a busy hurricane season, but especially this year.
You said they're cutting off as of July 31st. What is that deadline?
Yeah. So these are Department of Defense satellites that have been operating for many years. There are 3 weather satellites that are operated by the Department of Defense. They're polar orbiting satellites. So they're lower to Earth. They're about 500 miles up, but they give us a lot of detail. And they have these really cool microwave instruments on them that basically detect the energy that it's being emitted back into space and allow us to get a 3-dimensional look. You might think of it like an MRI if you were to go to the doctor and kind of see what's happening inside of the hurricane. But they've been around since 2006-ish or so. Their lifespan is only like 3 or 5 years. So they are well beyond where they should be. But there's no reason to think they won't continue to operate at least for another year or so. We were alerted by the Department of Defense, though, that they were going to shut these off at the end of June due to cybersecurity concerns. This was a surprise to everybody. It was a surprise to the forecasters at the Hurricane Center. Typically, when a satellite is turned off, you're given a pretty long heads up about it. They'll give you 3-6 months so that you can prepare for this. This was sprung on everybody. And so there was a pretty big ruckus that was made about it, including from yours truly. And they decided that they were going to allow the satellites to continue to transmit the data through the end of July, and then they were going to shut them off. The satellites are going to continue to operate. Like I said, the estimates are at least for another year and a half, maybe even longer than that. But because of those security concerns, we're not going to have them for the peak months of the hurricane season this year.
Where do you want to leave us with this conversation?
Well, I think what I would just like to stress to everybody, forecasting in general, I mean, I'm in the field of hurricanes, but forecasting in general is one of the great success stories of predictive sciences. I mean, it really, truly is. It's amazing that we can, in some cases, confidently forecast a hurricane 7 days out before there's even a puff of clouds. Like, that is incredible. And it's not something that just happened overnight. This was something that was built over 75 years. There were a lot of great scientists that put a tremendous amount of work into getting us to where we are. And we've really seen an acceleration in the improvements of weather prediction just generally, but especially in the hurricane world. It's become now almost expected. We know where the hurricanes are going to go. I mean, there are hurricanes that are just like spinning right off the coast that 10 or 20 years ago, we would have evacuated everybody for, but now we can confidently say, no, the hurricane's going to turn, we'll be okay. But we need to continue to fund all of that research, all of that science, the forecasting, and the majority of that funding is on the federal side. It's the money that the taxpayers are putting into this. And let me tell you what, you get a great return on that investment in both the lives saved, but also from an economic standpoint. The estimates are that the progress that we've made over the last 15 years from improvements in hurricane forecasting has saved us about $5 or $10 billion a year to the economy. So, it's something that's well worth investing in, and I hope that everybody can appreciate that.
Michael Lowry, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I appreciate being with you.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith Rogers, and Stephanie Desmond. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Michael Bonfils, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production coordination by Catherine Ricardo. Analytics by Elisa Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.